So, our next special guest is here to, at Frontier, I think it's clear that we care about coasters and we care about rides. You've seen Planet Coaster, not only the sort of sheer number of coasters and rides that we actually have in that game, but also the attention to detail that goes into making them realistic and interesting and exciting to use. And I think that our next guest speaker, it's a subject that's very dear to his heart, certainly. This guest speaker has provided entertainment and experiences at some of the world's most famous attractions, including Alton Towers and the Science Museum here in the UK. So please, a huge warm welcome. I know you guys can do it. The thrill engineer himself, Brendan Walker.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I am at Thrill Engineer on Twitter if you want to tweet this. I'm Professor Brendan Walker. I'm the founder and director of Thrill Laboratory, which is an organization of scientists, technologists, artists, and designers who all have a passion for designing and creating thrilling experiences. And it's great to be invited here by Frontier and by Planet Coaster to talk about how I design thrill rides, because I'm sure an awful lot of you already in Planet Coaster are already designing your own thrill rides. So I like to think of roller coasters as factory machines that process riders and deliver a product, thrill to them. That's the valuable bit, delivering thrill. It's a little bit like a factory machine that processes donuts. And just as this factory machine can be assessed for its efficiency for the sugar coating it delivers to its donuts, so too can a roller coaster be assessed in the way it delivers thrill to its passengers. But there's a problem. Not all donuts are the same. They all like to be coated in very different ways. In fact, I'll leave the donut analogy there. I can't stretch it too much further. So I'll turn to this sorry group of 4 subjects who I experimented on at Alton Towers in 2008. As they rode Oblivion, there are just 4 of 100 people I experimented on. And part of my experimentation was to use a technique called psychometric profiling. I mean, they all are, as you can see, very different people. They all like to be thrilled in very different ways. And to understand how people like to experience thrill, we performed this test, the psychometric profiling test. The test I used was developed by Professor Marvin Zuckerman at Delaware Tech in the US. Now, Marvin's sensation-seeking scale assesses people on 4 dimensions. The first dimension is the thrill and adventure-seeking scale here. How much we like to undertake sensational activities. In fact, this is Joe Walker, one of the first X-plane pilots going at supersonic speeds. He would have scored probably 10 out of 10 on the thrill and adventure-seeking scale. The second dimension is experience-seeking, often confused a little bit with thrill and adventure, but experience-seeking is all about seeking new and wonderful experiences. So people who like to go to experimental theatre, go to the circus, see amazing cinematic films, they will all score very highly on the experience-seeking scale. The fourth dimension is disinhibition. So if you're the kind of person who likes to spontaneously burst into song and dance at a conference like this, probably might even catch Ed doing that later, you will score very high on the disinhibition scale. And fourthly, susceptibility to boredom, how likely we are to become cross at having to wait, which is particularly useful to know if you're designing queue-line experiences for roller coasters. Now, Marvin didn't just look at theme parks when he was doing his studies, putting together his sensation-seeking scale. He also looked at other parts of the industry like firefighters or soldiers. In fact, those particular 2 jobs, people have a very low susceptibility to boredom, but also have a very high thrill and adventure-seeking scale, which is great, because 95% of the time, as a soldier, you're doing absolutely nothing, but live for that moment, that 2% when you're actually called into action. Now, understanding your audience, people who are visiting your rides, is crucial, and it's something that fairground showmen, as an art, have been doing for centuries, for generation upon generation. because the people who visit their parks, whether they're young children all the way up to the elderly, they all have a very complex mixture of thrill and adventure-seeking, sensation-seeking, experience-seeking, disinhibitions and susceptibility to boredom. And the fairground showman needs to collect a series of rides together which can cater for this demographic. And at a theme park, we're looking to try and target 95%, the 95th percentile of the demographic. There's something for everybody at the park. So now we know that creating thrill is actually quite a subjective undertaking. We are all different. We all like to get our thrills in different ways. What actually is thrill? Well, science describes thrill as the exhilaration or excitement in response to novel stimuli. That's as far as science goes. It doesn't tell us what this novel stimuli is. So, as an exercise, let's consider a body free-falling through space. Quite thrilling, you'd imagine. Over a distance, S1, underneath the effects of gravity, G, and then to be decelerated by some force, some factor of G, over a distance, S2. That's a very scientific way of describing the motion of the body, but how many different ways can this be performed? Well, let's imagine a skydiver, often a solitary flight, over 13,000 feet, with the thrill and anticipation of whether their parachute will open when it's deployed, maybe 5,000 feet from the floor, to become gently glide down to the ground safely. Compare this to the high diver in Acapulco, whose only technology is probably a tiny pair of Speedo swimming trunks, and if he survives being dashed against the rocks at the bottom, maybe a pina colada and the applause of his audience waiting for him down there. This is a scene of terror. This is actually a real photograph taken in 1947 by a photographer, Arnold Hardy. It is a woman jumping from a burning hotel in Arizona, much to the terrifying effect of the audience who are witnessing this, revealing in front of their very eyes. Over 4 floors she plummeted. But there was thrill and excitement because she survived. She only broke 2 ankles. In fact, Arnold Hardy, this is another thrilling twist to this story, went on to win the Pulitzer Prize because this picture was published all over America. Another hotel, this time in Paris, Disneyland Paris. It's Hollywood Tower, the Tower of Terror, where Disney takes this idea of free-falling vertically, but very controlled, but also giving the illusion of danger. And each time you stop in apparent safety at each floor, you're met with some horrific vignettes that you have to grapple with as a visitor to the attraction. But this wasn't the first vertical drop ride to appear in Paris. In fact, just as Monsieur Eiffel was designing the Eiffel Tower, so too was Monsieur Caron designing the first thrill ride for the Eiffel Tower, a vertical drop ride, where passengers would travel between a distance of P to A, inside, safely ensconced inside, a steel capsule. And the riders would sit in very comfy sprung seating. The capsule would plummet and succumb to rest very gently by hitting this champagne-shaped lake below to be decelerated and to get out safely. It was never made. Now, it may have been thrilling, but calculations have shown that these passengers would have met their most certain doom due to the deceleration forces involved. So some rides probably best not to be made. But how far do you need to be dropped vertically before you can create a sensation of thrill? I mean, this is a question of efficiency. Why drop somebody too far when you can drop them only a short distance? And this was actually a very real question that Alton Towers asked me when they were designing 13. As you probably know, it's the world's first, goes horizontal, and then there's a sheer vertical drop. Because for every extra inch of steelwork, it was going to cost them tens of thousands of pounds to create more steelwork. And also, they wanted to make sure that they make that 95%, the 95th percentile of visitors to Alton Towers would be thrilled. So I just calculated how long it took for the brain to process danger, the stimuli of danger, being dropped in the dark, the brain to process that into an emotional response, which would then be translated into a physical response, both facial expressions, shrieks, and people grabbing hold of the roller coaster handles. It turns out that that time translates to a distance of over 7.5 meters. The drop on 13 is 8.2 meters, so you get a little bit extra. So now we get the idea that there's an efficiency, or there's value in considering, or an economic value in considering the thrilling efficiency of a ride. We think, well, how can we quantify thrill now? So we know it's valuable, how do we quantify it? So I turn my attention to emotions. Now, science says that one way to describe emotions is in 2 dimensions. Arousal, which is how much our body gets excited and pumped up and ready for action, and also valence, which is the scientific term for pleasure, from highly pleasurable all the way through to highly displeasurable. If you map out all emotions in this very simple 2-dimensional space, you can see that if you're very negative valence down here, with very high arousal, you'll get a sense of being annoyed. With very positive valence and a very high sense of arousal, you get a sense of being excited and jubilant. But this is just a snapshot in time. We don't experience emotions just like in a very sort of in this very sort of snapshot way. Our emotions are constantly changing. In fact, when you look at how our valence and arousal changes over time, it's a very complicated picture that emerges. Our emotional states are in constant flux. And it's when I interviewed people about designing their own thrilling experiences, so people who would go whitewater rafting illegally, people who consider themselves to be extreme knitters, others who made proposals of marriage in weird and wonderful places, they all reported that they experienced thrill when there was a maximum and large increase in pleasure and arousal together. And this brings me to the Walker thrill factor. The Walker thrill factor says you can quantify thrill by the amount of valence and arousal that you're changing, and also the rate of change of valence and arousal, delta VA over delta T. Now, this next graph shows that, or illustrates the point, that you can't be thrilled all the time. So if we're looking at the change of valence and arousal over time, this sawtooth waveform here, for every high, there has to be a low. That thrill relies on the movement between low emotions to high emotions, which is why there's a close relationship between horror and thrill as well. And you find that if we can work out the attack and decay of this thrill profile, you can work out a theoretical maximum that a human can experience thrill by doing anything that they're doing that could be considered thrilling. And it so turns out, so through surveys of different rides in the UK that I've conducted, that even the best thrill rides only achieve an efficiency of about 20%. Now, when I'm talking to people who market the rides, they say, well, that's incredibly low. Can we not get a thrill factor of maybe 80 or 90%? And I say, well, no, it's kind of, we don't experience thrill like that. And then put it into context, if you think about the internal combustion engine, which has been designed and developed for decades purely to translate fossil fuels into mechanical motion, its efficiency in doing that is still only around 20%. So thrill rides are doing incredibly well to be matching that kind of efficiency. So now we know we need to work out valence and arousal as a sort of theoretical sort of commodity. How can we start to capture that data and actually really measure and determine the thrill rating for each ride? Well, science and physiology gives us a real helping hand here. When the body becomes aroused, the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated in the human, and the sympathetic nervous system, in turn, activates a whole series of bodily organs. Heart rates start to go up. You start to breathe quicker and more shallow. Your pupils become dilated. Your skin pores open and your hands become sweaty. And if we use microprocessors and sensors on the skin, we can start to determine these changing values, these different levels of arousal in the human body, and assign some value to them. But you'll also notice that this woman here is wearing sensors on her face. The human face is built to express emotions. There are 42 different muscle groups in the face, and they all, in various micro fluctuations, communicate different emotional states that we're feeling. And this is a science which goes back to Darwin and then Duchenne, and more recently, Paul Ekman in the 1970s. The two different muscle groups I'm really interested in are the zygomaticus major, which is the smile muscle on the side of the cheek, which gives me an indication of levels of pleasure, and also the corrugator supercilii, which is the frown muscle above the eyes. And so they give me an indication between extreme displeasure and extreme pleasure. I was asked by the BBC back in 2011, in fact it was actually for Blue Peter, to survey rides in the UK, a selection of rides, to determine which of those rides was the most thrilling. It turns out that Rage at Southend-on-Sea, at Pleasure Island, was the most thrilling ride. In fact, this 3.5 million ride, which uses Eurofighter-style hardware, is exactly the same, slightly different configuration, as the 13.5 million pound ride at Thorpe Park, Soar, which clearly the extra money has gone into the theming and the theatre of the whole ride. Now, this brings me on to the final part of my talk, and probably most appealing for those of you who are designing your own rides in Planet Coaster. That there are 4 design rules I like to fix in my mind when I'm designing rides. It's the art of ride design. The first one that I always consider is sensation. And this stripped-back ride of Rage really illustrates the point. It scores so high because of its relatively small footprint and the rate of change that it creates in the rider's sensation as it twists and turns. You can see there's a real intensity of experience in this ride. There are no long stretches in this ride. It's constantly moving and changing. The forces we experience, which are related to our change of acceleration and linked to the centripetal force. It's not just the acceleration, it's the change in acceleration and the change in acceleration, which scientists call the jerk, the jounce, the snap, crackle, and pop. All differentials of distance over time. And we get an idea that this is a hugely intense ride. But there is only so much force, physical force, that the body can be exerted. There is a kind of maximum that we can do to elicit a sense of arousal by throwing the body through space and time. In fact, this is something they found out to their cost at the loopdeloop in Coney Island, which is one of the world's first inverting roller coasters. As you can see, you would come down the slope, you would enter into an almost perfect circle and escape out of the ride. Now, it has been shown more recently that the G-forces that you experience entering into that circle were around 10 G. Bear in mind that rides today probably don't allow you to go much more than 6.5 G. The amount of whiplash and injury to body and limb that occurred on this ride was so great and so frequent that there was a nursing station permanently situated at this ride just for Coney Island. They never closed it down. Today, this is the shape you're probably more likely to see. This is the clothoid loop shapes. There are ways around that we can start to make these ride features more efficient. In fact, this is one of the first drawings I created when I was asked to design and build the world's first inverting human slide, open that is. You could fall out of the loop if you weren't going at the right speed. And I say safe because I wasn't allowed to let my rider go more than 6.5 G entering into this loop. The reason the clothoid loop is so efficient is that the circumference of the circle is quite large entering in, so the G-force, the centripetal force, is quite low. And then when you get so high before you run out of potential energy, you'll turn into a much tighter circle to whip you around the top, and then it opens up again to gently get you out of the circle. Let's see if I manage to make it a success. Hey, that's science and thrill together. Hey. Of course, what I didn't show you were the many attempts we made before that. But one of the things that that particular spectacle relies upon, and obviously you've all just been party to watching that, and imagine when that's broadcast to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on TV, it's the fact that it's a spectacle. There's a certain amount of wonder and awe and a question of, gosh, how did they do that? You know, how did science manage to make us do that? In fact, this sense of wonder and awe is nicely illustrated by this very early Victorian theme park ride, which if any of you have been on Hex at Alton Towers, you'll know exactly the kind of sensation we're talking about here. Riders would sit in a gondola at the bottom. They would start to swing very gently inside a room, nothing strange there, but then the room would mechanically, unbeknownst to the riders, start to revolve backwards and forwards in a counter way to the way that you were swinging. Eventually, the room itself would flip 360 degrees. The riders would believe that they just performed an absolute miracle of going completely over themselves. Again, a wondrous thing to experience. It relies on theming. The fact that they're actually situated in a room that appears to be quite normal. It's a Victorian parlour with a pram, lighting, a hat on a chair which would fall off clearly if the room had gone upside down, but it's all carefully staged. And this is a point which Rem Koolhaas talks about in his book on Coney Island. He basically talks about the strength of theming to reinforce the spectacle when you're trying to deliver a thrilling experience. This is a palatial light show, themed light show at Coney Island. And Rem Koolhaas says the formula he uses is technology, which is the ride hardware, plus cardboard and string, which is the theming. So the cardboard and string doesn't need to be very elaborate, just enough to immerse you, equals reality. So basically, you can elevate a ride, let's say Rage, add a layer of theming, and it becomes Saw. It becomes transformed into this theatrical spectacle, which amplifies the experience of thrill that the riders will be experiencing purely from the physical sensation. But let me go back now to the loop at Coney Island. We don't just have to rely on centripetal force to keep our bums in the seats as we're going around a ride. We can also use rider harnesses and wheels to keep the car on the track. This experiment that I conducted on riders at Oblivion at Alton Towers, I was measuring their levels of arousal. I started recording before riders got on the ride, hoping to see what level of arousal they would achieve as they went over the vertical drop. When we got back to the lab and started to analyze the data, there was something unusual. The moment that the ride harness is put on the rider, the rest of the ride only ever achieves 80% of that moment. The most thrilling moment is when somebody's locked into that ride. And they talk about this element of loss of power and control, and there's a certain excitement related with that. And so this is the third aspect of designing thrill I like to talk about. We have sensation, we have spectacle, and now we have this gameplay, really. This is very much, I think, very much Frontiers territory, allowing people to gain and lose power and the thrill associated with that. You'll also notice that this ride has these little cameras that I'm fiddling about with here. This is the fourth area. This is to do with performance. I actually monitor people's faces so that the scientists I work with can decode their facial expressions to help me determine the levels of pleasure that riders are experiencing on the roller coasters. But there's also something else I'm doing with these cameras. I'm experimenting, I'm experimenting with taking that data and broadcasting the picture live outside the ride to entertain an audience. In fact, the next video I'm going to show you is of a woman at the Science Museum riding a ride called the Booster, which is an 80-meter long arm which whips around at a great speed with the riders at either end. Her facial expression is being broadcast. In fact, it's actually being projected live on the side of the Science Museum, and that's a massive building for all the passers-by to see. Well, I'll let Sam speak for herself.
I'm absolutely fine at the moment. Okay, yeah, they're speeding up it now. This is absolutely brilliant.
Heart rate at the bottom right. G-force at the top, so that's 0.7, 1.3. I'll leave Sam there for the moment. She did survive. But the point is that for Sam to know that she was performing to an audience, and for the audience to know that Sam was experiencing these horrors and delights, it set up this kind of performance space, which is nicely illustrated by this relatively very gentle ride at Coney Island, which is called the Cakewalk, which is set up, I think, as a kind of piece of theatre, that the riders on these moving platforms, as they go along, are jostling up against each other, creating funny moments of interaction. But the whole thing's played to an audience of spectators who are taking great delight in seeing this ride unfold. And so that's the fourth and final area of design that you can think about when you're designing rides in Planet Coaster. But what am I doing now? Now that I have command of all the science, all the technology of thrill-seeking, I understand people's personality types, I understand a little bit more about the artistry of how to create thrill rides, surely I must be making some amazing thrill rides myself. Well, this is what I'm currently working on, a playground swing. The challenge to myself is, can I take a playground swing, a millennia-old technology, apply 21st century cutting-edge digital technology, virtual reality, to create a truly thrilling ride? The way I'm trying to do this is by understanding the physical forces. Okay, they're much less than the physical forces you'll experience on a roller coaster, but understand the forces that a rider is subjected to as they control their own ride experience, take those physical forces, monitor them, and use those forces to generate a virtual world which creates moments of wonder and awe, and hopefully thrill. This is just one experiment I've created that I'm going to show you now, which makes a rider believe that they end up going at a high speed through a city. And if I can generate a sensation of thrill on a £1,600 ride, imagine what I'll be able to do once I'm let loose on a £16 million roller coaster. Thank you.
Brendan Walker, everyone. Huge round of applause for Brendan Walker. Possibly the coolest job title in the world. Who doesn't want to be a thrill engineer? I think you've probably persuaded a lot of people here to look into that. Do you have to do a degree in thrill engineering before you can become a thrill engineer?
Yes, at my own university.
At your own university?
Yes, at Thrill Laboratory, yes.
So if people want to put applications into that, they can just find you on the show.
Just fine, I'll be wandering around.
Please don't, yeah. I think we actually do have time for a couple of questions now from the audience. There's going to be a roaming mic. The amazing Fern is going to be holding a microphone. I think we've got a couple of moments. If you could stand up when asking a question. If you do have questions, any questions at all for Brendan? Oh, we have one over there from a young man over there. If there's a microphone coming over to you over here. If people could get some questions ready, that would be very handy. If not, I'll have to do it, and that would be terrible.
What's the biggest coaster you've ever made?
Oh, the biggest coaster I've ever made. The teams of people who are involved in making roller coasters is quite massive. And in fact, I'll give the answer. So there are many coasters I've done little bits on, a little bit like 13 you've seen there. But a lot of my rides that I make are a lot smaller. They're like swings, etc. But the ride, I'll answer this by, the ride I wish I'd made is probably the best thrill ride that I think exists in the world, is Spinball Whizzer at Alton Towers. Now, people probably think that's not a very big roller coaster, but in fact, what it has over the rest, when you think about pleasure and arousal, it makes people laugh a lot. And you know, this is something that Disney does very well on their rides. If you can make people laugh a lot, as well as be a little bit scared, then that would be way more thrilling.
Wonderful question. Thank you so much. Yeah. Anybody else got a question? Further down the line, if you could stand up as well while asking your question, if you don't mind. Thank you, Fern. Sidling through.
Hi. I don't know if you've been on Devon Brown's Ghost Train at the park. I wonder what you made of it, because it seems mostly theatre and quite light on the actual roller coaster type elements.
Yeah. I think Darren certainly fits into the Victorian showman category, and certainly more of the horror trains that we've seen. In fact, there are other artists like Maria Karniski who've tried to reinvent rides. But I think Darren's right. Yes, it has got some jiggling bits, but I think they could probably do with a drop feature in there. That's my personal feeling. I think to go wholly theatre may be a mistake, but I think it's very strong in some areas, but is lacking maybe in physical sensation. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I think there's a gentleman all the way over there. Oh, sorry, a young lady.
Stand up on the chair.
Okay, Fern, if you could make your way around that way, that'd be fantastic. Yeah, and if everybody, during your questions, if you could also put your hands in the air so we can get to the right place whilst this question's being answered, that'd be great.
What was the scariest ride what you made?
Oh, I wish I'd shown it. It was an experiment. In fact, if any of you have experienced Saw Alive when it was at Thorpe Park, it was a horror maze. And I was asked to go and try and, let's say, improve it a little bit. I introduced the use of gas masks and to be able to monitor the breathing of people as they went through the ride. And I actually used night vision cameras to look at that person's face at the same time. And then I projected that outside Saw Alive. Now, there was one woman who went through it as I was developing this product, whose daughter was outside, the woman was inside, and she was screaming. The daughter was going, "Get my mother out, get my mother out. She's absolutely terrified. I want her out there." And I said, no, let her in. Keep her in there. And when she came out, she took the mask off, and she was crying, but she was laughing at the same time. And I think that is crucial to all rides. If you can create something which is really scary, but also people will laugh at the same time at the end.
Okay, I think a couple more questions. We've got some hands down there. Yeah.
I was just thinking, do you think any parallels between some of the thinking that you were talking about with roller coasters and pinball?
And paintball?
Pinball.
Oh, pinball.
Anticipation, loss of control, the way that you can't control the ball fully.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my particular interest and specialism is understanding the human physiology as part of the equipment that I'm playing with. But certainly gameplay and interaction is absolutely the same. In fact, there's probably more aspects of gameplay and rapid gameplay in something like pinball that you're moving in tenths of seconds, whereas on a ride, those emotions are probably changing over seconds. So there's probably a greater intensity of experience in something like pinball than there is in roller coasters in some ways. But again, you lack the physical sensation. So I don't know if we could create an extreme pinball ride. I don't know, human inside a ball. That might be quite good fun.
One more question. I think the gentleman at the back has had his arm in the air. Is that John Stabler as well? Right behind Zach. Right behind you, Zach. There you are. There you are.
Just wondering, when you release the VR swing thing, are you going to actually release it to everybody, or is that just going to be an experiment for another ride?
Okay. So the VR swings actually opened this year. They're currently on tour. They open in Greenwich at a festival there. They're now going to Korea for a little while, but they will be back in the UK in the autumn. So if you check my Twitter stream @ThrillEngineer, you'll find out when they're back in the UK. I have a bank of 8 of them, and I'll be touring them around the UK. You could try for yourself.
Fantastic. And a huge round of applause again, please, for Brendan Walker. Brendan, thank you so much.
Good.